Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started in 3 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started in 1 minute.
Hey, good afternoon. This is Jacob Bardeen with CSA-DC. Thank you all for joining. I'm just going to wait about another 30 seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, hey, good afternoon. This is Jacob Bardeen with, I'm a member of the CSA-DC Events Committee. Thank you all for joining. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of having Mark Warner present to us. So Mark is a customer solutions engineer at Red Canary, and he's going to walk us through the foundational principles that a security team can use as they collaborate with the DevOps to improve security in cloud workloads. Currently, Mark works with customers to help secure their corporate environment. In the past, he's served as CTO for a technology startup and numerous other roles in IT leadership and technology over the past 20 years. So with that, let me turn it over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen out here. Yeah, let's check here. All right. You guys see my screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time today. So today we're going to talk about getting to secure DevOps. So this is a very interesting topic. I do have a strong IT background myself, so I can kind of relate to this. As I did transition over the years to more of a security role, there's definitely that kind of interesting piece there, that kind of back and forth and kind of a fight sometimes too. It's interesting. So as my career has kind of developed over the years too, and that's kind of something I've noticed at Red Canary specifically, is some of the customers I work with, all too often we're bringing in SecOps first, then it comes to DevOps second. So there's definitely that kind of role, if you will, and kind of how they kind of go back and forth. So we'll kind of talk about that, some of the things that I've learned, some of the kind of tricks and stuff too that we've kind of learned to kind of share with you guys to kind of get you on that role, if you will. So myself, Mark Warner, like I say, been here at Canary for about 2.5 years now. I'm about 20 years now in the industry, which is really interesting to say. But I first started out in IT roles. I started with large corporations. The first time I touched things like virtualization was back in like 2001, 2002. So I've been around that environment for a long time now myself. And also it does kind of give me perspective too. To me, it's interesting to think about not only where we're at now, but just over the time, how things have really progressed and changed. That's been very interesting for me as well. I kind of bring some of that value into the conversation too, and talk about that, and try to make it interesting as well too, and kind of and fun for everybody. But that's kind of where my passion comes from, and kind of my personality, and kind of the things I think about. It's not only like how you can like help the process, but also help the business too, and kind of make that work kind of overall. So that's kind of like I say, kind of my perspective on things. So first off, DevOps, what we have. So right now, from infrastructure perspective, it's too easy, and that's good and bad. It's good because it makes our jobs a little easier as we're trying to deploy things and push them out. On the bad side of that, if it's too easy, we can be a little careless sometimes and not think about it. And that's kind of one of the things you have to be careful. And that's because security in the past has always been like a focus that's kind of toward the bottom of the list. Of course, the focus here typically for DevOps is things like pushing product out, getting out in the wild, making sure it's uptime, that kind of thing, checking resources, that kind of stuff. That's the important thing, like I say. But like I say, in that back end piece of it, the security piece is kind of on the back end, and that's kind of what I'm trying to bring to the forefront now, more or less. Roles like DevSecOps, it does exist, but honestly, I have yet to meet a person that is DevSecOps specifically, so it's interesting. And I've worked with some pretty large customers. A lot of times, more often than not, like I say, it's security teams specifically. Then you've got DevOps kind of working hand in hand, and I think that's been a pretty good method. They do seem to have different requirements, though, and that's what's interesting. Security is worried about, of course, reducing risk, and DevOps is, of course, worried about getting things to market, pushing out, that kind of thing, uptime, resource utilization, that kind of stuff. So another upside too is developers can create what they need. That's great. A lot of great tooling out there. Lots of opportunity for developers to really just create and curate what they need to really get that to market, like I say, and that's really a great thing. So I love how that's really blown up over the years. Also too, plenty of management orchestration tools. This is a good thing. I'll definitely talk about this. I think it's one of the key pillars to really making a successful process around what we think is good DevOps for securing it, is having that kind of management orchestration tooling in there. It's really the key there is just, you want to be able to scale kind of reusable code that allows you to kind of scale things very quickly in a very secure, repeatable manner. I think it's very important. And kind of taking the time to really build that base up. Like I say, that's a really important part of that process too. Kind of what we're missing, and I kind of already touched on this a little bit, but really advocacy for security before deployment. And that's things like, before you are deploying, you're thinking about, how this can affect things long term. So thinking about, as we're deploying workloads or even containers, that kind of stuff, thinking about those services that are on there, right? So thinking about how they're locked down, how they're configured, think about that exposure from a security standpoint. What are the potentials for someone to get in here, and kind of like going through that process. It can be tedious sometimes, I get that, but just locking it down, taking the time to do it. And also too, from a business perspective too, this is something that's kind of missed sometimes. But having the buy-in to the business, like that's also important too, to understand that it takes longer to do security sometimes, like that's a big piece of it as well too. So that's also an interesting thing you have to think about too. Maybe in your day-to-day, like I say, if resources have become more expansive to us and we can do more, we're expected to do more. But taking that time to slow down, like I say, and having the business understand that, like they have to kind of get that buy-in too. I've been with a lot of customers in my experience where, you don't have that business buy-in, and security can advocate for it all they want. And if they're not buying in, it's just not going to happen. And that's just kind of that business piece you have to get over as well too. Also just fundamental security. So understanding that foundation of security, getting that proper, just knowledge base in place so you can just kind of do those parts as you are doing that kind of DevOps role. Understanding those basic fundamentals, things like locking down systems, configuration control, that kind of stuff. Understanding, vulnerabilities, knowing what's on your network, kind of avoiding shadow IT, that kind of stuff. Those kind of fundamental things, if you will. And also too, just full awareness of risk and, threats unique to the cloud. So again, just kind of talk about the same thing, talk about the services, what's out there, what are the potential for risk, what are the potential misconfigurations I can look at. And also too, like when it comes to the cloud, there are some specific risks out there. We talk about containerization specifically. We did see one recently come out that was actually specific to containers. It was called Siloscape, it's called. It's a really interesting threat. They actually found a way to actually get into containers and then actually laterally move into the actual node itself. So that's actually the first, we had kind of a theoretical idea before, but now it's actually turned into the reality. That one came out, I think, earlier this year. You can look it up online and research it if you want to. It's a really interesting use case of like things that are to come down the road. So it's really interesting, like I say. Kind of navigating that path, what is secure DevOps? It's kind of 5 steps we put together. I think it's just a really good base to start from. Of course, any of these can be really, really drilled into, especially when it comes to security. I mean, you can go and go and go as long as you want to. There's a lot of areas you can get into, and you can really dig in far, like I say. But just kind of these 5 steps are what I'm going to review today. And first, just security and awareness training. Very important piece of kind of setting up that foundation, that kind of first base, that kind of first stepping stone to get on. Just getting that training in place, and again, just getting that buy-in and start putting that kind of effort, energy into that. Also setting standards for code. So I mentioned this before, code is the way we can deploy things now is very powerful, and having that code base at your fingertips, you can really go through and curate those different types of deployments and really get really, really granular. It's very powerful. And also too, you can kind of spread it out. You can have multiple cloud deployments if you want to, multiple cloud providers, which is pretty cool. But allows you to really just, push a button and go and really execute that same repeatable code base. And as you go through testing and whatnot, like, what works and what doesn't work. And you can kind of iterate that as you go, which is really cool as well. Automate as much as possible. Automation is king. It really is. And, back where I come from, we didn't have all these fancy automation tools. Now we do, and they're really, really great. And there's a lot of great sets out there. It really gives you very powerful, and also gives you that scalability, repeatability I've talked about that is really pivotal to kind of making a successful kind of security DevOps program, if you will. Also, frequent reimaging, redeploying, very important as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But just, if it is some kind of a workload sitting out there, just redeploying it with that new base, if you will. Don't let them hang too long, because then you get in trouble sometimes. That's important too. And you can do it, like I say, with repeatable process automation and having all those different cloud platforms in place. It's relatively simple to do when it comes down to it. And that's really important as well. And the last piece, and this is something that I'm, kind of near and dear to my heart, is take runtime seriously. This is kind of what Canary does. So we'll definitely talk about that. But, what is a runtime threat? And this is kind of interesting. We kind of go like old IT, we kind of talk about prevention techniques, then it kind of goes into the acceptance, and you talk about detection and response. This is kind of a take on that. We're looking at runtime threats as they come in, and then we're responding to those threats too, like I say, so that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. And I'm seeing a lot more corporations identify this as a potential threat, as a potential just a vector that can come in through. And so we're seeing a lot of good adoption around that as well too, with some of the corporations and whatnot. Kind of for security and awareness training, first thing is just get beyond the pen testing. Penetration testing is great, like I say, but it is just one step. Beyond that too, focusing on fundamentals, that's kind of what I'm talking about, the different trainings and stuff you can get into. For the type of training I would do, I would say it really kind of depends on what you're deploying. If you're looking at certain types of systems or certain types of, containerization, certain platforms, a lot of times you can find training that's specific to those. So the more pointed you can get, even SANS has got some really good training that's based on cloud workloads specifically. They've got some really, really good stuff out there. I'd encourage you to look at that. I think one of them is like SEC 540, I believe it is. That's actually specific to DevOps and to actually cloud containerization. It's a really, really good one for kind of getting and it has a really good, I've never done it myself, but I've read the description through it. I've heard about it. It looks to be a really good program to get into. So that's one example there. But like I said, any type of vendors out there, you look at them, the more focus you can get on the type of thing you're doing and also the type of service you're looking at. So an example of that would be like if you have, of course, web services or database services, that kind of stuff, you want to look at those specific vendors and what they're doing and really focus on those things too, what's actually in your workload. Like I said, it's a good kind of a place to start for training. Also too, Mitre attack. This is more of a security concept. It's a really good one. We love it at Red Canary specifically. It's really great. It's a great framework to really go through and think about tactics and techniques and procedures, which is, of course, kind of they call it the attack chain. For that, you're looking at, it's a good way to map it out and see what your coverage is. It's more of an advanced topic, I would say, but allows you to really see when you start thinking about your network and infrastructure and things that you're really worried about, you start to develop out what's called TTP, it's your tactics, techniques, and procedures. The companies that are more advanced actually know the things that they're worried about specifically, and you can start putting different, coverage around those specific TTPs, if you will. And this kind of gives you that framework to really work on that. So it's really a neat, really interesting framework. We build it into our technology a lot, but it is out there at the website. It's just mitre.org. You'll see it out there. There's actually attack frameworks out there. They have They have sub techniques too, which is interesting as well. But it is a really good way to kind of scale things off and kind of based on the from a reporting standpoint and also monitoring going forward. So as threats do happen, you can kind of tie them into it, and you can see like maybe hotspots in your network. If we are getting attacked in these specific areas, it's a way to kind of identify those as maybe a place you might want to improve as well. So there's a lot of advantages to using Mitre specifically around awareness training and security. From setting standards through code, I mentioned this before. We've got a lot of great applications out there, and just setting up that standard. Push the infrastructure as code. So like Terraform is a great example of that. It really is amazing. If you guys haven't used it at all, I'd recommend just going out there. They have a tutorial you can go through to really kind of get you that basic kind of setup of how to utilize it. So it is really good. And Terraform itself, like you can really programmatically go through and really design out those different types of deployments, which is really great. So I definitely would encourage you to look at something like that to kind of set that code base up and kind of create that standard, if you will. And from that base too, also set up your hardening and your secure base images. That's important too. So I talked about it a little bit too, but just kind of hardening that, looking at specific applications, specific to the operating system too. Get that nice and hardened and continuously do that too. It's not just really doing it in the moment, but also like designing a process around that too. If you think about that, that's kind of really doing too. Is you think about it from like a higher perspective. I'm designing this code base and this hardening kind of process around it. And then I'm using that to kind of push everything forward is what I'm trying to do, right? So that's a big thing. So kind of creating that up and then just having a process in place to kind of revisit that as you go along too is really important. New vulnerabilities come out, try to stay on top of that, figure out what's going on, have a process around, updating, keeping things current, and then pushing that out to, of course, to your production as well. And then, of course, beyond that too, the basics, kind of touching this a little bit, permissions, networking, apps included, just checking those over, big fan of like least required permissions, what is required on the system for each user, kind of minimize that, if you will. Also networking, how do you limit that, your kind of your attack vectors, if you will, kind of your exposure to the network. It's also important too to kind of lock those things down, get those networking, whatever you use for networking on a system, to kind of lock it down and just like expose the ports you want to expose, that kind of limiting that exposure to the actual internet itself and what can be out there. So automate as much as possible. I did talk about this a little bit too. Like I say, you're creating that process that's repeatable. So you're kind of locking it down, creating that process that you can repeat, like I say. Also like enforcing, security requirements for each deployment. And that means, you're kind of finding a way to kind of enforce that within the organization. So if your DevOps team is going out and doing this, you're kind of saying, okay, this is the way to do it for testing maybe. But if we're going to GA, like we want to use this process, right? Like I say, so it's enforcing that process too. So how do you enforce that? And a lot of that's just driven by policy. Policy on the back end, creating that policy that's repeatable, and having your entire organization really work around that. That's a very, very important piece as well too. Also account for edge cases. Of course, it's going to happen. We have to be flexible. It's part of the role of just being a DevOps person. Those use cases are going to come up. When they do happen, document them. Write them down. Know what's going on. There's a use case out there that's great. Okay, why is it there? Why does it exist? And kind of keep circling back to it too, because if things do change down the road and I can kind of get rid of that edge case, that would be ideal, of course. Is it realistic? It all depends on the business and what you're doing. But of course, just document that, having it down somewhere, so and just again having that process around that to keep kind of circling back to it, if you will. Also, like I mentioned before too, try to eliminate shadow IT, so shadow deployment. When things do go rogue, and this kind of goes back to that same use case, those edge cases, if you will, too. A lot of times it's really easy to deploy, like I say. So, it's a wizard. You go through, you answer 4 questions and hit go, and it deploys the server for you, right? It's awesome. It's amazing. Okay, great. Well, how do we limit that? Like, that's the next question, too. So how do I go back and kind of inventory of that? How do I keep track of things, those edge cases and whatnot? And it kind of falls in that same vein, too. But automation is really key to here as well. So re-image and deploy frequently. Absolutely. Like I said, it's very easy to deploy when it comes down to it. If you have that code base in place to really repeat that process, that's a very important piece too. And if you're doing it properly from the ground up, it's not a big deal. You can reimage and deploy as you need to. Like I said, as frequently as you need to. I would have some kind of a process in place to kind of address that. So what is acceptable risk from the business in terms of like how often I want to redeploy or how often I want to push these out? And of course, the more you can do it, the better. Because if something does get compromised in that system, and you aren't aware of it, for example, which does happen sometimes, it could. Like I say, cloud workloads have become kind of a potential threat vector for a lot of companies. We're kind of realizing that now, and they're kind of playing catch up, I feel like, if you will. But if there's something on there, of course, you wipe it out, it's just going to go away, right? I mean, it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it does work. And so we do encourage you to kind of reimage as much as possible. And of course, keep those patches, those vulnerabilities under control. That's part of that reimaging process too. Of course, you can't push those workloads directly if you want to, but just kind of making sure you're having that base setup. Like I say, it's a good, secure, repeatable process that I can push it through to kind of push those updates through and patches and whatnot as well too. So. And also the bottom part, reduce the potential for persistence. That's kind of the same thing I was talking about. Just setting a policy around that. How long is it acceptable for me to have a container or like a workload out in the world? Maybe it's a couple of weeks. Maybe it's I don't know. Just depends. Like I say, it really depends on the business and what's ideal for you guys. And the last piece, this is take runtime seriously. This is something that I do focus on in my day-to-day life. So it is something I'm very passionate about. Don't just focus on a risk, address threats. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to know what's going on. So that's a big thing there. There are some really good, logging monitoring tools out there to kind of do runtime. A lot of the CSPs have them built in now, and it's a great place to start. But when it comes down to it, a lot of these workloads are, some version of Linux typically. I've seen a lot of EDR vendors out there really take their existing EDR kind of sensors and kind of change them a little bit to work on workloads, if you will. The big caveat there being you have to read into containers. That's the biggest thing when you do containerization. So how do you get that data in a programmatic manner? Also, too, I see a lot of stuff around like specifically, utilization, like resource utilization. That's a big thing too. I feel like for a lot of DevOps people, something we look at as well too at Canary. But just having that process in place to find that evil. Logs are a great place to start, but EDR has kind of become that de facto standard when it comes down to it to really find threats in real time, and leveraging those new technologies or existing technologies. Using something like OS Query, for example, is a great example of that. I can put it in the machine, I can query a system in real time, I can look to see what's going on in the environment. Or just having different sensors, like I say, to really pull like really good high quality telemetry from those machines allows me to really and then of course having a strategy around that. That's a whole different, it's really secure SecOps specifically, but you're pulling telemetry, you're seeing what's going on, having a process around that to really find those things that are going on. And then when something does go on, you have a process to kind of, handle that as well too. And that's kind of the last piece here as well. So when something does happen, how do you respond? What's that process you're going to do with it? And the last thing, if companies that get really, really advanced, they start thinking about it from different optics. You start thinking about not only, am I actually finding a way to find threats and recover from those threats, but I have a way to kind of validate that strategy as well too. And that's kind of like that kind of really advanced stage you'll get to when it comes to SecOps specifically. How do I, not only how do I find them and validate them, but then how do I validate my assumptions based on those threats that are coming as well down the road? So whatever that process is, and it might be like, threat comes in, we found something on a container or some kind of a, some kind of a workload out there. It might just be to tear it down, right? Like I say, we can just redeploy a new one. Maybe it is. And then you want to practice that and validate that process, like I say, throughout the process as well. So yeah, that kind of wraps it for me. So this is, of course, a couple resources I talked about. I talked about Mitre. Mitre is a really good example. They're nonprofit. They have a really good strategy about looking at, like I say, the Mitre attack matrix is very powerful. It talks about tactics and techniques. It's a really great resource to really find for kind of looking at that like I say, the reporting piece of it, right? So what are the things I'm worried about in my environment? How do I track those? How do I think about that? How do you think like an attacker is kind of what you're doing in that aspect? That's how I like to think about it. When you look at the actual matrix, you'll see that, but it is a very powerful tool. And of course, SANS too, I mentioned them a couple times too. They've got some really, really good trainings out there as well too. So I would definitely look into them. I know they have some really good focus on that are just specific to cloud workloads and for DevOps specifically. So yeah, that kind of wraps it up for me. I see we have a couple questions down here. We described difference between DevOps and DevSecOps. Well, it's so DevOps is, of course, more of like the, generally speaking, you're going to be delivering code. You're going to work with your dev people. They're going to be build the code, giving it to you, and your job is really to push that out into the wild, right? So they're giving you a process to do that, and you're kind of developing that process. Like I say, that's kind of the DevOps responsibility. DevSecOps is someone that's ideally you're thinking of security first and foremost, is what I would say. That's kind of how I would kind of put that first, because you're more of a security focused individual. So instead of like putting security to the bottom of the stack, maybe it's kind of the top of the stack is what I would say. That's kind of how I would position that. But honestly, I mean, if you go out and look at job descriptions, they're going to vary. I feel like the role is still kind of new and up and coming. So I guess each company is going to have their own individual take on that. But that's kind of how I see it. It's just someone that comes in with like a security first kind of fundamentals, and then they kind of work down from there. Or maybe it's like the same weight, right? It's my job to deploy this, get it up and going, but also I'm going to take security too, and we're going to kind of put them side by side as like equal. Whereas like typically, DevOps, they put security kind of toward the bottom as a thing you kind of think about. That's kind of typically how I see it. So it's kind of pushing that kind of rank up to the top is what I would say, and just kind of putting that security first and foremost, then kind of thinking around that is how I'd put that. What is your relationship between platform engineering and DevOps? Platform engineering, I guess from a Canary perspective, we do have our platform engineers, and I guess really it's kind of the focus of what they do. From our perspective, platform is more like the software that kind of resides, that is kind of like the customer forefront. So it's kind of the platform piece, also how we integrate with other pieces, if you will. That's kind of like their focus. And really for them, it's more like, how do we integrate with other platforms? So platform is like kind of a high level thing, I guess, is what I'd say. And then beyond that, we're thinking about other platforms and how they relate to our platform. It's kind of how I think about that. Whether it be like an EDR product or it be like another third party application, that's kind of that piece of it. And then the DevOps piece of it, once they do their coding piece, they actually go through, do their actual coding, they're going to hand it off to DevOps, and it's DevOps' job to really kind of deploy that and push it out. And so they'll develop that methodology to really push it into the wild. So like our customers are seeing it, or pushing to our dev environment or the actual GA, like I say. So that's kind of that relationship there, and they kind of work hand in hand. It depends on the methodology too. Like I know, like what we use now, for example, we use sprints. So we have like a 2-week sprint we go through. After the sprint is completed, it'll then get pushed to DevOps. It's the DevOps job then just to kind of push that out, roll it out to the actual community itself, and you'll start seeing it too. So that's kind of that relationship of how they work hand in hand. One more question came into, we got DevOps versus DevSecOps versus SecDevOps versus no OP. Great question. I would say, DevOps, of course, I kind of hammered down on that. What is DevOps? DevOps is, of course, the deployment piece. It's working hand in hand with your developers, kind of creating that development strategy around that. I would say DevSecOps and SecDevOps, they're kind of the same. Honestly, I think they're just trying to figure out what to name it, and those are the two candidates that came up. I don't really see a difference between the two of them, to be honest. I think it's just a naming convention problem. And then no OP, I don't know what that actually is, to be honest. I've never heard that one before, so I apologize for that. But in terms of like I say, DevSecOps and SecOps, like I said, they're really kind of the same. It's just more a matter of what you want to call it in the moment. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. And maybe it's an argument between who's more important. I don't know. Who's more important, the dev guy or the sec guy? So honestly, I don't know for sure. And that's a great question. It's really could be debatable for as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, I really appreciate all the questions.
Anything else, guys? We can appreciate the time, but any other questions, you can either put them into the chat room or the Q&A session.
Oh, no ops. Okay. Yeah, I had to look it up here. I've never heard of no ops. No ops is basically it's become so automated that there's no need for in-house individuals anymore. It's interesting. Yeah. I have yet to encounter that. That sounds like kind of a future goal. That seems pretty interesting. I have yet to see that, like I say. So I guess that's the direction maybe they want to go in the future. where basically, everything is completely automated, and I guess just really, I guess dev can do it themselves when it comes down to it, and not have to require on DevOps specifically. Awesome. Any other questions for me at all?
Yeah, there's a couple more in the Q&A section, Mark.
Okay, great. Immutability. I guess I haven't stumbled across that yet. That's a great question. I'm not really sure how that relates to DevOps. I'm sorry I can't answer that question. I have to get back to you on that. RPA and DevOps automated testing. Can you be more specific on the RPA question? Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. That's AI and ML are, of course, kind of up and coming buzzword technologies. I'm not saying that they aren't valuable, but I haven't really seen them hit DevOps specifically yet, or at least we don't utilize them in our organization. But it is a really good question. Is it coming? Is it coming? Most likely, yeah. Imagine it will. AI is something that's something I'm definitely keeping a close eye on for the future, and I'm curious where that's going to go. But it is interesting for me, like when I think about those specific technologies, a lot of times they're kind of buzzwordy, to be honest. They'll say a thing and then you'll kind of lift the hood off of it, and it's really a lot more. It's just basically a couple of statements that are just basically programming statements. But I think it does have a future for sure. But it's kind of weird in the industry as you watch it. Like I feel like buzzwords kind of come out and then marketing kind of grabs onto it and they figure out a way to position it. So like right now, an example of that would be like in security specifically. There's like a buzzword around XDR. XDR is a really interesting kind of conversation amongst like security professionals. I don't know if you guys have heard that before, but it's basically extended detection and response. So like you'll see a lot of vendors out there saying we have XDR, but we haven't settled on what XDR actually is yet. So it's another one of those kind of conversations about that. But I guess that's one of those kind of things, like I say. So AI, ML, I see it utilized. Results will vary, is what I would say. So I really haven't seen it utilized in a DevOps environment quite yet. Either way, are all our automations with code that are on. Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say there in that last question. Either way, that all are automations with code, question mark. Gotcha. That's the difference. Gotcha. Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, let's do one more here from Caleb.
Yep, sounds good. Do you see DevOps becoming more distinct from other positions and moving towards greater integration? Yeah, I think so. I think that that does make sense, especially when you think about kind of the SecOps positioning around that. I mean, when you're doing like a sec DevOps position, I mean, it definitely is becoming more integrated. That's for sure. I think that's an important piece of it. So I think so. Yeah. I mean, as the business goes on and you see different types of methodologies come out in terms of like programming, obviously they're becoming a very pivotal part of a business when it comes down to it when you're DevOps, especially if you have some kind of a platform out there that is hosted, that is on the internet. There's going to be a lot of value around that. And the closer you get to that product value, I think the more value you bring as an employee, as an internal employee. So absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think it's going to definitely become more pivotal, like I say.
Okay, thanks. And Mark, do you want to just spend 30 seconds and talk a little bit about Red Canary and what you guys are doing there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Red Canary. Yeah, so Red Canary is an MDR provider, and we work with right now we work with a lot of EDR partners out there. We do actually have a specific cloud workload protection platform. It's now been renamed to MDR for infrastructure. It does focus on specifically cloud workloads. We designed it from the ground up using a code base that's meant to be secure and lightweight and work with containerization and also have a lot of compatibility. So our objective at Canary is to really focus on outcomes. So instead of like giving you a sensor or a piece of software that's just going to give you a bunch of alerts, like we actually focus on what the customer gets out of that. And so our objective is to really work that to ground. It's a combination of technology and people together that really give you like focused outcomes is what we're shooting towards. So cloud workloads is a piece, like I say, we also work with other providers too, and really any kind of an endpoint that you can throw a sensor on, we do work with. But in the future too, we are developing a platform that position came up too. So we are continuously adding onto that too. And I even mentioned XDR. I mentioned that for a reason. It is something we're thinking about too. So what does XDR look like in the future, and something we're working toward as well too. So a lot of interesting things. We're a smaller company, kind of a startup right now, but we are growing quite a bit and really trying to make a difference in the world when it comes to security outcomes and really helping businesses and whatnot. So.
Okay, great. Well, definitely appreciate your time and the presentation. And thank you to everyone for participating. And so with that, we will wrap things up. Thanks again and have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.